I rise to lend my support to the mover of the bill shortly entitled the Anti-Proliferation Financing of Weapons of Mass Destruction Bill that is before this Honorable House. Mr. Speaker, this bill, though a relatively short one, is, I believe, an essential international statement that we have the privilege of discussing here today. Mr. Speaker, it would have been some 75 years ago, near the end of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. As a matter of fact, on August 6th, 1945, that an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima by a US B-29 bomber called Enola Gay. And it killed some 70,000 people in one go, one bomb, directly. By the end of that year, 1945, December 1945, it's estimated that some 100,000 people had died from the radioactive sickness, the fallout from that bomb. Cancer and other effects continued to plague the inhabitants of the city of Hiroshima for years, for decades. It would have been 3 days after that first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima that another bomber dropped a similar bomb on the city of Nagasaki, also in Japan. And this, of course, brought to an end the Second World War, that deadly war that killed millions of people in the European sphere of engagement, but also all over the world. Many Kittians had journeyed to participate in that war. But it began a frightening period, Mr. Speaker, for mankind. It signaled the threat of what could happen if there was to be an exchange of that type of bomb across the world, a nuclear holocaust. Today, we are faced with the threat that small actors, individuals and terrorist gangs can bring widespread destruction and hardship to this world with scaled-down bombs, small bombs, and other forms of weaponry. We recognize that these atomic bombs and the subsequent development into nuclear bomb as weapons of mass destruction. But this is not the only form of a weapon of mass destruction. And the move of the bill would have spelled out what a weapon of mass destruction is. But bear with me while I also give a similar description. A weapon of mass destruction is a nuclear, radiological, chemical, or biological, or any other weapon that can kill and bring significant harm to numerous humans or cause great damage to human structures. Example, buildings, natural structures, mountains, or the biosphere. It has the capacity to inflict death and destruction on such a massive scale and so indiscriminately that its very presence in the hands of a hostile power, a group, or individual can be considered a grievous threat to mankind. Modern weapons of mass destruction, again, I've mentioned them, I repeat, can be considered nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. And it is this proliferation, this spread of weapons of this kind that this bill before this Honorable House speaks to. It speaks to the financing by anyone of creating, spreading, using weapons of this nature in the pursuit of terrorism. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing here today is to ensure that St. Kitts and Nevis has the necessary financial structures in place to combat this spread of weapons of mass destruction. Mr. Speaker, as the honorable move of the bill would have indicated, St. Kitts and Nevis has been in the process of seeking to fortify our compliance with international financial standards for quite some time now. There are two main international institutions that have been involved in promulgating the requisite standards that we seek to comply with. The first would be the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, as it's called for short, is one such body. This FATF was initially formed in 1989 in Paris, European body, with the objective of targeting international financial crime in the form of money laundering. But, as the mover of the bill has said, after the events of September 11 in 2001, when terrorists flew a jet plane into New York City's World Trade Center, and many people died as a result, it soon became the international watchdog, that is FATF, for both money laundering and terrorist financing. And in that connection, it seeks to ensure a coordinated global response to prevent organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. Mr. Speaker, the FATF is responsible for developing standards to safeguard against certain global threats. And they have developed some 40 recommendations to buttress those standards. Recommendations are a reflection of how the FATF has evolved in addressing its attention to cover emerging threats, and the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is one such threat. Mr. Speaker, we here in St. Kitts and Nevis are part of the global community. We are interconnected. We do financial exchanges every day. We have corresponding banking relations that are monitored by such institutions as FATF and such like. And it is the exchange of financial instruments, of the movements of monies from North America to our jurisdiction and elsewhere in the world that we have to comply with these standards to ensure that we don't have illicit actors being involved in the spread of money under the guise of supposedly legitimate concerns, but supporting, as it was, the spread of financing, of money that can be used to spread a small bomb, biological warfare, chemical weapons. And that is what this bill is seeking to do. Mr. Speaker, this global security is the business of every country and every party to the international arena. And as we are a responsible actor in all of this, we remain dedicated to the preservation of that international security. If there is one lesson that we have learned from the pandemic, it is that we have our part to play in keeping each other safe. The actions of one country or one state can easily have the potential to mushroom in a manner that can devastate an entire globe. In that regard, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is a critical threat to the survival of humanity. And although the idea of weapons of mass destruction and their financing may seem far removed from the reality of our sun, our sea, and sand, it is easy to recognize our vulnerability if we consider the level of destruction that may be visited upon any country by the use of these weapons we have described here. And maybe, Mr. Speaker, you can recall that unforgettable plume of Sahara dust that made its way from sub-Saharan Africa across the thousands of miles of Atlantic Ocean and enveloped our beautiful environment here in our region. From Trinidad in the south all the way up the island chain, across the leewards, and into the southern United States. This, to me, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates how we are inescapably interconnected in our physical and our natural space. We are also, Mr. Speaker, bound up economically in this global community similarly. But the aspect, Mr. Speaker, that the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction really touches on us is our human connection. Mr. Speaker, this is a fight against terrorism. It's one of its worst forms, against the evils of genocide and indeed against the potential destruction of the human race. And so, Mr. Speaker, I wish to say that we as a democratic nation, we firmly believe in meaningful conflict resolution that involves useful dialogue and a real engagement and exchange of ideas. And we must therefore lobby against the use of all forms of chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. In other words, Mr. Speaker, we should utilize our vast access to the scientific knowledge and innovations of this age to prolong, preserve, and ensure a better quality of life for all of us on earth. We as a peaceful country and as a people, we will continue to strive for the maintenance of peace, for sustainable development, and for the advancement of the good of humanity. We believe that these ideals are better advanced in an atmosphere of democratic partnership, respect for natural justice, and the unyielding support for law. Mr. Speaker, if I was to turn to the bill itself, you would note that at clause 3, following the interpretation section, where it speaks to the fact that Anti-Terrorism Act means it's already passed by this Honorable House and is noted at cap 4.02. We speak to a DNFBP, a designated non-financial business and profession, as defined by the Financial Services Regulation Commission Act, FSRC Act. It speaks to an entity, a legal person, and legal arrangements. The FIU, our Financial Intelligence Unit, the FSRC Act, and so forth. We also speak to the Proceeds of Crime Act in this short bill. And of course, the UNSC, as described in this bill, is the United Nations Security Council and the United Security Council resolution. At clause 3, Mr. Speaker, the bill appoints the Attorney General as the competent authority. And I read, the Attorney General is hereby established as the competent authority with responsibility for designating persons or entities to the United Nations Security Council and its relevant committees, pursuant to the obligations set out in the following United Nations Security Council resolutions that impose targeted financial sanctions in respect of the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the mover of the bill, the Honorable Prime Minister, member for number 7, has listed some of these resolutions dating from 2006 all the way up to the year 2017. At clause 4, Mr. Speaker, is the nub of this bill because it speaks to freezing without delay. And it states at sub-clause 141, where the United Nations Security Council designates persons or entities pursuant to the United Security Council resolution set out in subsection 1, or any other United Nations Security Council resolutions that relate to the prevention or disruption of the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all natural and legal persons within St. Christopher and Nevis shall freeze without delay or prior notice, and it lists some 5 instruments that would have to be frozen. At A, the funds or assets that are owned or controlled by those designated persons or entities, notwithstanding that those funds or assets may not be linked to a particular act, plot, or threat of proliferation. At B, those funds or assets that are wholly or jointly owned or controlled directly or indirectly by designated persons or entities. At C, the funds or assets derived or generated from funds or other assets owned or controlled directly or indirectly by designated persons or entities. At D, it speaks to funds or other assets of persons and entities acting on behalf of or at the direction of designated persons or entities. And E, to ensure that no funds or other assets are made available in St. Christopher and Nevis to and for the benefit of any designated person or entity without the prior authorization of the UN Security Council. And it goes on to identify how this would be enacted, the freezing without delay, using such entities here as the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Financial Services Regulatory Commission, who would bring to the attention of the Attorney General that certain individuals have been listed on the UN Security Council's website and lists, and under the various legislation that have been enacted in our country to control, as it was, actors designated who may want to use financial instruments in our country for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And it sets out offenses that would be charged if anyone, any natural person, was in contravention of not carrying out the various clauses of this act. And so forth, Mr. Speaker. This bill, which allows at Section 6, regulations that the minister may prescribe to support and help us to enact it. This bill, as we say, is critical to our membership of the international community and how we conduct ourselves in the international arena. Mr. Speaker, I would like to lend my support and wish this bill safe passage to this honorable House as we seek to fulfill our international obligations. May it please you.